is an assistant professor in soil microbiology. She is with the University of Florida IFAS at the Soil and Water Sciences Department and Southwest Florida Research and Education Center in Immokalee. It's all yours, Dr. Strauss.
Thank you, Manji. Thanks for having me come out to sit here and speak with you guys, and thank you all for tuning in. So this morning I wanted to talk to you a bit about some of the work that we've been doing with cover crops in citrus and explain a little bit about why we're doing that, some of the initial results we're seeing, and some of the other things that we're thinking about as we've gone through this process of trying to implement cover crops in some citrus groves here in Southwest Florida. So to start, what are cover crops? Probably familiar with them, but just in case, I think it's good to start on the same page. And that cover crops are basically crops that are planted only for the benefit of the soil. They're not really harvested for profit, and they're planted to promote benefits to the soil itself. And so this is a practice that's not new. Cover crops are not a new management strategy. They've been around for as long as we've been doing agriculture. They're becoming increasingly more popular, I think, at least in the US, for grain, cotton, corn, soybean production, but it's also used for some vegetable production, and it's also been used in tree crops in various ways. We've got pictures of some groves from Florida from the 40s and 50s that have very nice cover crop stands, but for a variety of reasons, at least in citrus in Florida, it's not as common a practice currently. For grain crops and row crops and vegetables, the cover crops are generally planted during the fallow season when you're not producing your cash crop. And they're often combined with conservation or no-till management practices, again, trying to increase the benefits to the soil in those systems. So why would you want to plant cover crops? There are a variety of reasons, and some of these might be more important to you than others. And some of them, the efficacy of cover crops kind of depends on some of these different parameters as well. So one of the key things about cover crops is, depending on what kind of cover crop you plant, they can provide nitrogen to the soil and enhance nutrient cycling of the nutrients present in the soil. They can reduce weeds by outcompeting weeds, reduce soil erosion, which for certain situations and certain crops and areas in the country can be a really big issue. They can reduce soil compaction through, again, the greater root biomass, increase soil moisture, and increase soil organic matter, which I think for Florida and for a lot of our interests is one of the big potential benefits of planting cover crops. And so I wanted to spend a few minutes here on what is soil organic matter, why is that something that we're considering, and why do we think that that's important to think about. Soil organic matter is really just soil material that comes from living organisms. So whether that's plants, animals, microbes, all parts of the plant, that all contributes to building soil organic matter. And why is that important? Well, for a variety of reasons, but in this figure where you see that we're starting with adding organic matter, the very next step is that adding organic matter can increase your biological activity and diversity. So as a microbiologist, that's super important. That's one of the main benefits of adding organic matter, is that you will then allow for the increase of biological activity. You provide food and resources for soil microbes to increase their activity and diversity. And once you do that, you have a whole slew of benefits. That's going to increase decomposition. That will, as you decompose that plant material, that organic matter, nutrients can be released. They can be taken up by your plants. Depending on what's going on in your soils, you might have
Max.
You might have some substances that are detoxified. Increased decomposition can contribute to forming aggregates, possibly. You can release other sort of various compounds that can promote growth and root growth in plants. All of these things can combine to provide a healthier environment for your plants. And it's all from that first step of adding organic matter and increasing your biological activity in your soils. But as all of y'all are probably familiar, soil organic matter in Florida is a little tricky. And so this is a photo of, you know, what we often think of as really nice, healthy, rich soil organic matter from the Midwest. It's got this deep, dark color. You know, a lot of people, when we think organic matter, that's what we think of. But yeah, this is what our citrus groves look like. It's beach sand. It does not look the same thing. Actually, when we are looking at a soil map of South Florida and where citrus is predominantly grown, our soils generally have only 1 to 2% soil organic matter in these areas. And there leads to a variety of issues that we're all familiar with as far as nutrient leaching and moisture retention. And so we're starting kind of from scratch here, I think, as far as the idea that we have need to improve soil organic matter. We have very, very low amounts. There's not a magic number for what is, you know, what's your target soil organic matter. That's something that is often debated, I think, in soil health circles and different agricultural circles. And a lot of it also just depends on your systems and what is possible to achieve based on that particular system. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. So we've got low organic matter soils here in South Florida in our citrus groves. So what can we do to that, to improve that? And so cover crops are an excellent way to build soil organic matter because they are providing plant biomass and root exudates. And so you are getting a large amount of material that is being contributed to the soil for decomposition, for that enhanced microbial activity to build that soil organic matter. And so that can happen through both the biomass and through substances in the roots that are released that can attract certain microbes and again enhance some of that decomposition activity. And so I mentioned earlier that another benefit of cover crops and planting cover crops is possibly the addition of nitrogen. So how does that nitrogen get added to your soil? It happens when you plant legume cover crops that have this symbiotic relationship with certain types of bacteria. And so these are rhizobia bacteria that attach and colonize legume roots, and they fix nitrogen for the plants. And so the plants provide carbon for the bacteria, and the bacteria release nitrogen that can be used by the plants, and some of it also gets released back into the soil, both while the plant is alive, and then once that cover crop, that legume cover crop is terminated, that nitrogen gets released back into the soil. I always like to share this bit because I find this a fun fact, a little bit of trivia for you. And that the way that these rhizobia fix nitrogen and nitrogen fixation, the process itself requires really low or no oxygen. And so that's why these rhizobia bacteria form these nodules that you might see on your legume roots. And if you slice that open, one nodule can, depending on the rhizobia and a variety of factors, could contain up to 10 to the 9th rhizobia. So that's a huge number of bacteria in this little tiny nodule. And if you slice it open and you see that it looks pink, that's because there's a protein that buffers oxygen that's used in these processes that's really similar to the hemoglobin in our blood. And so that's why if you get it at the right time and you slice it open, sometimes it looks pink. So it's a little connection between us and rhizobia. So I mentioned that if you plant legume cover crops, you can potentially release nitrogen in the soil, both as the crop might be alive, but predominantly once that crop is terminated. The amount of nitrogen that's going to be released really depends on the type of cover crop, and the types of rhizobia. Different rhizobia are more efficient at fixing nitrogen than others. But there can be really tight relationships between the type of rhizobia that will colonize a legume. It can be specific to different legume species, and so that's a whole other talk that we can have. but that can play a role into how much nitrogen might be available into your soil. The other factors that can really influence this are the termination method. How do you terminate those cover crops? When do you terminate it within the plant's growth stage? There's been some studies that show that end release is a little slower when the cover crops are left on the surface and not incorporated into the soil. Most of these studies that I might mention have been done with row crops. Obviously, it's a little harder to incorporate some of this material in the middle of a citrus grove. And so some of these things, you know, we are still trying to look at and figure out how important that might be. Older plant material, if you let your cover crop grow for a longer period of time, and again, depending on the legume, it might become more woody, and so that material decomposes a little more slowly. But again, a lot of those studies have not been done necessarily in South Florida conditions. So that's something that we're still very interested in. And so a lot of that end release really just depends on that decomposition rate. And so that can be influenced by things like temperature and moisture and soil pH. And so it's this entire environmental system that's working together to determine these contributions of these legumes to your soil system. So nitrogen fixation is certainly one way, and one of the more direct ways that you might have nitrogen contributed to your soil through cover crops. But there are a couple of other ways through the rest of the nitrogen cycle. And so microbes are involved in all of this. And so we have here your cover crop residues that are going to be decomposing on the surface. And so that can contribute basically the mineralization, the release of that organic nitrogen from that cover crop residue is released in the soil by microbes. And so we can have ammonia oxidizing bacteria, ammonia oxidizing archaea, under the right conditions will consume that nitrogen and release it into the soil in these forms that might be more available for plants to take up. The entire nitrogen cycle does occur in these soil systems, and adding cover crops can influence both the input of nitrogen through nitrogen fixation and nitrification, and the release of nitrogen through denitrification. And soil moisture can play a big role in some of these factors as well, as far as how much denitrification occurs, how much of that nitrogen that's being put into the system is then subsequently released back into the atmosphere. A lot of that has to do with those soil environmental parameters, as well as the different microbial communities. So that's a little bit about some of the nitty gritty on the importance and the components of how cover crops can potentially benefit soil organic matter formation and nitrogen inputs into your soils if you're planting them in your groves. There's also some practical things to think about though. And a lot of these, if you've tried cover crops, you're probably familiar with all of these questions. If you haven't, yeah, these are things to think about. These are certainly things that as we've been working on our project, we have come across, and I don't have solid answers for all of them, but I think they are things that we are all working on trying to figure out, are there optimal methods based on these questions? And so in a citrus grove, sometimes people plant trunk to trunk, like in this picture, and you've got cover crops extending across the whole row middle underneath and underneath the canopy. Other folks just plant in the row middles and keep that under the canopy area still clear using herbicides. There are pros and cons to both methods. I think a lot of it has to do with your management strategy. And so that's something to think about when you are thinking about planting cover crops. The timing of when you plant, some of that depends on the types of cover crops that you might want to plant, which I'll talk about in a minute. We've been doing a lot of work with annuals, and so we are planting generally twice a year, trying to take advantage of the rainy season. And so in citrus groves, and one of the key components of planting cover crops, particularly in citrus groves, is that we really want this to be a low input system, a low input management technique, and that you plant the seeds and that's it. You don't need to fertilize them. You're not supposed to water them. We don't want to have extra steps that need to be done in order to have a nice cover crop stand. And so water is really one of the keys here. And so if you're not going to be irrigating the row middles, and so we found that timing the plantings with rain is super, super critical for getting a good germination and getting a good initial growth of your cover crop. And so in general, we've been trying to plant right at the beginning of the rainy season. So end of May, early June. And then we'll let that grow during the summer and generally terminate towards the end of the rainy season, October, November, and try and get that next round of cover crops planted in before the rains really taper off in November, October, November. And then that will grow through the spring and through harvest, and then we'll start the process over again. Potentially going to start experimenting with trying to squeeze in a third round of cover crops in the summer. And so terminate something early in August and plant another round from August until November. That's something that we're thinking about trying just to try and really to increase our biomass and try and take advantage of the fast growth that we often see with these cover crops in the summer months with all of the rain. The other thing to think about with your management is how do you want to prepare your field? How do you want to prepare your row middles prior to planting the cover crops? And so we've tested a couple of different things. Depending on your weed pressure, if you've never had cover crops in your row middles or you've had poor germination, we have done combinations of mowing and herbiciding. And so often we'll herbicide the row middle and then plant the seeds directly into the ground while the dead weeds are still present or dead cover crops, and then mow that, and so that dead biomass sort of covers the seeds and provides a little bit extra protection and extra insulation and moisture retention through germination. That process has worked relatively well for some of our projects, but I think, again, it really depends on your management style, your management practices, and what is your weed pressure in the row middles. And so we really want to try and reduce that weed pressure to reduce the competition of those germinating cover crops with the weeds. So I mentioned the preparing the row middles. The other question is, how are you going to plant your seeds? Are you going to use, what kind of a drill are you going to use? A no-till drill, one that has a light disc. I'm not the most familiar with all of the different terminologies for some of these equipment, but we've certainly done some trials where we've used both no-till drills and a really shallow drill, and we've seen germination with both. And so I think a lot of that really depends on the availability of the equipment. It's a row middle in your citrus grove. You don't want to go super deep and disturb your citrus roots that are in the row middle. And so that's one of the reasons we are looking at this no-till drill. But I think if you've got a really, really shallow disc, then that seems to be okay as well. So what are you going to plant? So like I said, there's a huge variety of different cover crops that you could plant and different benefits that you might get from some of these different varieties. And so you can have legumes, cowpeas, vetches, crimson clover. I don't have listed there sun hemp, which is actually one of the ones that we've had really fantastic results. And unlike other parts of the country, we can get sun hemp growing in our Southwest Florida trials year-round. It doesn't get as tall as it does in the winter as it does in the summer. In the summer, we can get sun hemp plants that are taller than me. But it does still grow year-round, and it does still nodulate and fix nitrogen year-round. And so that's been pretty nice. And I know some folks are concerned about cowpeas and vining, and so I think if you're going to plant trunk to trunk, that might be something to think about. We've planted it in just the row middles in a mix of things, and they seem to not get too big and not get too viney, but it really depends on the grove and the mixes that you're planting it with. I know there's been a lot of work looking at cover crops that reduce nematode pressure, and so there are a variety of cover crops that are non-host plants that are really good if you're concerned about nematodes. Cover crops in general help suppress weeds just by outcompeting weeds. But there are some that do a little bit better than others for that. And so that's something to think about. And again, I've mostly listed here annual cover crops. I did put perennial peanut here under nematode management. And I know that's, some folks have had really great success with planting perennial peanut. It's fantastic, it provides a really nice ground cover and fixes nitrogen. I think one of the tricks with perennial peanut is getting it established. And so that can be a process. And so if you're looking for building soil organic matter quickly and getting that biomass into the ground quickly, then that can be a little bit difficult if you're just adding perennial peanut. So we have not done any trials in my program with perennial peanut yet. There's a huge amount of literature, again, mostly from row crop and vegetable studies on what are the optimal mixes of legumes to non-legumes, what's the optimal number of different species to have in your cover crop mix. Should you have a monoculture? Should you not have a monoculture? Like I said, there's a lot of studies that have been done out there. I don't think anything is super conclusive. And again, some of that's going to vary based on whether you're doing an open field before you plant cotton, and whether you are doing the row middle in a citrus grove in South Florida. And so those are things that we're trying to think about at some of our projects. We did do some tests a few years ago at the SWFREC down here, just in an open field, of planting some different mixes, different numbers. You can see we had non-legumes, cowpea and sun hemp, and so different combinations of legumes, 3 legumes and some non-legumes. How did all that work? I think the key here is that if you don't have a non-legume, things didn't look so good. And so those legumes are providing nitrogen to a variety of crops, and they grow better because they're providing nitrogen. We didn't put any fertilizer in this field. And so that's just something to think about when you're trying to put together a mix and thinking about what varieties you might plant. So I've mentioned we are currently doing a couple of field trials. This is a CRDF funded project with Dr. Davey Counting-Compenny up at SWFREC, Dr. Ramdas Kanasari, our weed scientist here at the SWFREC, and Dr. Tara Wade, our economist here at the SWFREC, looking at trying to get some data on what happens when we plant cover crops in citrus. And so, you know, I've given you some information on what are the potential benefits, but we wanted to get some quantitative data on what happens when we do this. And so we've are now in, I think, year 2.5 of this project. And we've been collecting a wide variety of measurements, stuff on tree growth, canopy diameter, canopy volume, leaf area, weed growth, fruit yield and quality. Dr. Wade's been looking at some of the economics, looking at root growth and density, and of course, soil nutrients and the soil microbial community. And so I'm going to focus a little bit more on the soil nutrients and the microbial community, since that's my area. But first, we've got a couple of different treatments. So we've got 2 different cover crop mixes, one with legumes and one without legumes, because we really wanted to quantify what is that contribution of the legumes to the soils when we plant those mixes. And then we've also been doing 2 mowing treatments, which I'm not going to go into too much detail about today. But looking at whether this idea of eco mowing or reverse mowing, so that when you mow the row middles, the clippings get sort of directed underneath the tree canopy rather than falling just behind the tractor. And so if that provides some added biomass underneath the canopy, since we are not planting these cover crops trunk to trunk in this trial, and how that varies compared to just standard mowing. And so we've been doing 2 plantings a year of cover crops, and we have looked at a wide variety of different mixtures. And so I've got, I think these are all things that we have tried in the last 2 years. Excuse me. Some of these do better in the winter versus the summer. I don't think I've put in seasons for all of them. Certainly daikon radish, we only plant in the winter. Does not like the heat of South Florida summers, but it does grow really, really well, as you can see from this picture. We get lots of biomass from these daikon radishes. We've had, like I said, great luck with sun hemp. We've had some Suspania, hairy indigo, a variety of different millets, buckwheat, some clovers, some oats. I think we've also had some Sudan grass in there. We tried sunflower and we didn't really get great germination, so we haven't been testing that anymore. But again, these mixes have varied a bit from year to year and from season to season. But these so far seem to be doing relatively well. So initial results. Let's see, I was going to try and put my pointer here. Okay, so the first up is soil organic matter, right? This is one of the big things that potential benefits of planting cover crops. And so what happens to soil organic matter when we plant cover crops? So we've got two different locations. Both of these are in commercial citrus groves here in Southwest Florida. And for today's talk, I'm just calling them North Grove and South Grove, but they're in the general Immokalee area. And the trees are the same. They're both Valencia on Swingle, and were planted, these are older trees. They were planted about 20 years ago. And so if you look at the orange bars here, those are the percent soil organic matter at the start of the experiment before we started planting cover crops. And so for all the treatments here, you can see in the North Grove, we started at about 3%, which was actually pretty good. In the South Grove, we started at about 0.8% soil organic matter. And so on the x-axis, we have the legumes plus non-legume treatment, the non-legume only treatment, legume plus non-legume with the eco-mowing, and the non-legumes with the eco-mowing, and GSC is the grower standard control, which was just left to weeds, basically. And so you can see that, so they all start basically at the same place in orange. And after 1 year of cover crops, we saw a nice increase in soil organic matter in both the North Grove and the South Grove. So, which was really impressive for us, to be honest. I wasn't expecting such a giant increase initially. And so we had, at least a 1.5% increase in soil organic matter after that first year. Year two is in green, and you can see that there's some variation, but in general, it's still higher than it was before we started planting cover crops, and it's still higher than that grower standard control. And so we are seeing differences in these patterns of soil organic matter between the groves, and so that things had a really big jump in the South Grove in some places compared to the North Grove. Some of that has to do with the fact that the North Grove started out a little higher. And so I'll talk a little bit more about the rate of increase in soil organic matter in a bit, but that's something to keep in mind here. We also are seeing increases in soil organic matter with all of the cover crop treatments. We do see some bigger increases with the treatments that have the legumes for some of the, particularly in the South Grove. But in general, we're seeing increases in that soil organic matter when you're planting cover crops. And that has happened for both years of this project so far. So for soil nitrogen, I'm only presenting, I believe this is data after the first year, where we're finalizing some of the number crunching for the second year data. And so here we've got, again, the same treatments, legume plus non-legume, non-legume only, and then the mowing treatments and the grower standard control here in blue. And so we've got a little bit more variation here. But regardless, we're still seeing an increase in soil nitrogen, total inorganic nitrogen, when you're planting those legume cover crops. So this is the legume plus non-legume, and the legume plus non-legume with the mowing have more inorganic nitrogen, at least in the North Grove, compared to cover crops without those legumes or the grower standard control. Things were a little, not quite as straightforward in the South Grove, but regardless, we are still seeing an increase in nitrogen in the legume plus non-legume treatments compared to the grower standard control. As far as other nutrients, we are seeing a couple of differences with some other nutrients, and I pulled these out of the panel as just to illustrate some of the other things that we're looking at. Calcium, we saw an increase in calcium underneath the legume plus non-legume treatments. Same with magnesium and potassium. But those trends were really just present in the North Grove and not as much in the South Grove. And that's something we're still trying to look into and figure out why are some of these differences occurring. I should also mention these are all of these measurements were taken and made in the row middles. So these are not from underneath the tree canopy. These are from underneath the row middles where the cover crops are growing. There are still citrus roots under there too, but it's not directly underneath the canopy. So what about the microbes, right? I'm the microbiologist, so we saw these increases in soil organic matter. We saw these increases in total nitrogen. Those things should be related, hopefully, to some changes in soil microbes, and indeed we do see increases in soil microbial numbers. And so here we have year 1 and year 2 data. I don't have the eco-mowing treatments on here. For this, we are just focusing on the cover crop treatments. And so we have the legume plus non-legume and the non-legume and the grower standard control. And you can see that certainly in year 1, we had more a total number of microbes in the cover crop treatments compared to the grower standard in both the North and South Grove. And then that number increased even more once we got to year 2. And so this is a process, I think, of building up some of this material and building up that microbial population over time. And so we are seeing increases in total numbers of microbes in these treatments with the cover crops. What are those microbes doing? That's a good question. And so we've been focused particularly on nitrogen cycle microbes as we are very interested in the changes in nutrient cycling and nitrogen cycling with these cover crops. And so if we look at nitrogen fixing microbes, and so microbes that are potentially adding nitrogen to the soil, we have got the legume plus non-legume treatment, the grower standard control. And you can see that again, in year 1, we have a much greater increase in the number of nitrogen fixing microbes in the treatment with legumes compared to those that don't have any legumes. We see the same pattern in year 2. Didn't see much of a trend. It's the same statistical trend in the South Grove, but we are seeing some changes in those populations, and we're certainly seeing trends of changes in those populations. If we look at the total group of nitrogen cycling genes, and so we've looked at the individual components, and if we add them all together, we can say, what are the overall patterns and changes in the microbes that are involved in the nitrogen cycle? We see similar patterns. Again, for the non-legume plus legume treatment, if we have legumes in there, we've got more nitrogen cycling genes than the grower standard control. And that pattern seems to be increasing again with time. We see that both in the North Grove and the South Grove. So planting these cover crops, planting these legume cover crops is really enhancing that microbial nitrogen cycling community and increasing the numbers of those nitrogen cycling organisms. We are seeing some changes in the organisms that are involved in denitrification, and so this is releasing the nitrogen back either into components that might be leached away or back into the atmosphere. And so we've found a couple of different trends with some of those organisms, and so this is particularly of interest to us, again, from the microbiology standpoint, as far as what are those details and what are those components of the microbial community that are changing based on these cover crops, and how does that impact the availability of nitrogen. And so that's not only, again, the inputs of nitrogen, but also the release of nitrogen back into the atmosphere or back into the environment through leaching. And so we are seeing some changes in some of those communities too. And so this is an ongoing investigation of trying to tease apart those different components of the microbial community. So I had mentioned previously, one of the other big benefits of planting cover crops is potentially weed management. And so Dr. Ramnas Kanasari has been doing a lot of weed measurements of these cover crops and looking at that. And so we've seen some really nice results. Here, this is in the North Grove, both for spring of 2019 and spring of 2020. The cover crop number of plants is in green, number of weeds is in blue. And so you can see for all of the cover crop treatments, there are far more cover crops than there are weeds, and that weed number is significantly lower in the cover crop treatment than compared to the grower standard control. And this holds for both the North Grove, this is for the North Grove for both years. South Grove, a little trickier. We had a little trouble with germination of the cover crops, particularly in spring of 2019, and so we had a bit more weed growth than we would have liked to see. But by spring 2020, we got a little bit better germination, and so that really helped influence and control some of that weed population and weed pressure. So as I mentioned, we had seen some issues with germination of some of our cover crops. And so we've been thinking about, well, are there other things that we could do to really enhance that germination? Because, you know, we want to get them to grow. That's the whole point of this, right? And so, you know, certainly timing it with water, but we were curious if maybe adding some compost might enhance germination. Are there things that we can do to the soil environment to make it more conducive for germination of these cover crop seeds? And so we've been doing a little trial here at the SWFREC Grove where we've been applying compost right before we plant the seeds. And so we've been looking at 2 compost rates and comparing that to just planting cover crops alone. And so we've been doing 4.5 tons of compost per acre per year. And so that's rate 1 here in the middle, or 9 tons of compost per acre per year, which is rate 2, which is over here on the right, and then cover crops alone. And so here visually, it looks like there might be a difference. But if we look at germination, and this is from the first year of this study with the different cover crops, we just had 4 in this mix. We saw no significant difference in germination based on whether there was compost or no compost, or between the different rates of compost. We saw better germination for some of them in November, which is not too surprising because there was more rain than in January. But we weren't seeing any impacts of having that compost on germination. We were also curious if that would really help enhance the speed of building soil organic matter. And so here we have the control that had no cover crops and no compost. Here CC is cover crops only, and then we have the 4.5 tons of compost plus cover crops, and then the 9 tons of compost plus cover crops. And we did see increases in soil organic matter with the cover crops, but we don't see major differences in soil organic matter based on whether there were cover crops and compost or just cover crops alone. This was just after the first year of this project. We are doing another year of this trial, and so I will keep you posted and see if we see anything else happening. So I wanted to finish a little bit with some discussion about soil health, because this kind of goes hand in hand with cover crops and with thinking about why we're planting cover crops and how do we measure whether cover crops are having a beneficial impact on your citrus grove. And so, you know, first off, you know, what is soil health? And soil health is a term that I think we're hearing more and more frequently, but it's not exactly a new concept. You've probably heard about soil quality, soil fertility. These ideas have been around for a while. I think what sort of distinguishes the idea of soil health from soil quality and soil fertility is that in general, soil health includes biota and microbes. And though it's not to say that those weren't included when we discussed soil quality and soil fertility, but I think there's an increased effort to include that, that component when we start talking about soil health. And so when we talk about soil health, we're generally thinking of health in a way that will benefit crop production. So increasing nutrient availability, reducing the abundance of pathogens, and increasing plant growth. And if you recall, those are also all benefits of having increased soil organic matter and planting cover crops. And so, like I said, these things really go hand in hand as far as concepts. But how do you determine if your soil is healthy? And so this is something that certainly we think about as researchers and scientists. You know, what do we need to measure? What components do we need to measure? But I know some of you guys are also interested on what are the parameters that you need to look at. Obviously, we want to look at yield. That's the ultimate parameter. But are there things, you know, this might be a slow process. Are there other things that we can monitor to see if things are moving in a positive direction before we start seeing yield changes? And so that's, I think, where these ideas and concept of soil health measurements and parameters and indicators comes into play. And so again, these are not new concepts. Folks have been talking about measuring soil health and soil health indicators for a while. And some of the more common ones that folks have been looking at for quite some time include things like soil physical and chemical indicators like soil texture and bulk density, soil organic matter, which I've discussed today. Biological indicators, again, have been not as predominant in the past. Lots of focus on enzymes or soil respiration or earthworms. And so looking more at different things that are sort of proxies of microbial activity rather than actually measuring microbes themselves. And so from a microbiology standpoint, I think there's an increased interest in trying to figure out how do we look at the microbial community with this concept and with this idea of measuring and determining if your soil is healthy. Are there specific microbes in a healthy soil? Is there a healthy level of microbial diversity? Those are questions that we don't have answers to at this point. But there's increased interest in trying to make those determinations. And so two organizations that are really sort of leading the way on trying to come up with parameters and indicators for measuring soil health, including soil microbial health, is the USDA NRCS Soil Health Division and the Soil Health Institute. And so there has been, if you go to their websites, they have huge lists of different indicators and proposed indicators. And those proposed indicators now include a variety of methods for looking at microbial communities. And so these are a couple of the methods. But what I think is something that we're very interested in is again, what are these indicators and how frequently do you try and measure things to see if things are changing? And so again, most of the research on cover crops has not necessarily been done in tree crop systems and not necessarily for subtropical tree crop systems where we're growing things in the ground cover crop wise year round. And so are there short-term indicators that are going to change relatively quickly that we can monitor and say, oh, wow, something's really happening here? Or are there long-term indicators that we should be keeping an eye on from year to year to see gradual improvements? And so some of those depend on the stuff that you're measuring. And so how quickly we might expect some of those to change. Because building soil organic matter and changing soil microbial communities and changing soil nutrient concentrations can take time. And a lot of that depends on your particular environment, your conditions. This is a diagram from up in North Dakota and Minnesota where things are, they have a much shorter growing season than we have. And so things can take a very long time to build some of that residue and to build some of that soil organic matter and for that decomposition process to occur. And that might occur much faster here in South Florida where we've got stuff growing in the ground year round and we've got a lot of rain and really nice temperatures. And so what are those differences and what is the timeline that we can expect to see changes in some of these parameters? And so we've got a brand new project that was just funded by the USDA to try and address this question. And so we're going to be looking at what measuring soil physical, chemical, and microbial indicators, both short-term and long-term, in citrus groves that have cover crops, to say what are the things that are going to be changing, what are the things that make sense to measure, because this is the long list of measurements that we're going to be making. And so, you know, this is not a list that you would necessarily want to say, these are all the things I need to monitor to see if something's happening, to see if I'm on the right track with my cover crops. And so we want to be able to give a list of, you know, a short number of things to say, if you monitor this, you start to see changes in this, then hopefully you should be on the right track and should see bigger changes in your trees if this process continues. And so that's our expected goal. That's what we're hoping for. Like I said, this project is just getting started next month. And so please stay tuned for more information on that. And hopefully we'll be able to have a better idea of how things are changing with cover crops within different time periods and how quickly things might change. So with that, I'd like to just wrap up and say, you know, I think we've seen some really nice preliminary evidence that cover crops can really improve soil organic matter in citrus groves. I think there's still a lot of optimization that is needed, and it might vary a little bit from each grove. We've been primarily doing our trials down here in Southwest Florida. I'm going to be starting some trials up on the ridge actually next month. And so I know things are a bit different there. And so we'll be looking at how that changes and are there different things we need to do for getting cover crops established up there. But we've been really encouraged by the results we've seen so far. So with that, I'd like to thank a wide variety of people. In particular, I want to thank the postdoc in my lab, Dr. Antonio Castellana-Hinoso, who has really taken the lead on a lot of these microbial measurements and done some fantastic work there. The rest of the folks in my team have been instrumental in getting this, as well as all of our collaborators. And I'd also like to thank the CRDF for funding. And I'd also like to put a plug, and we'll try and post this in the chat. Dr. Tara Wade has put together a grower survey to get your inputs and thoughts on cover crops. And we would really appreciate it if you would fill out that survey. So I have this here, and we will, I'm not sure if Tara's already put it up there, put that link in the chat and encourage you to complete that survey. And that would really help us figure out some of these economic components of planting cover crops. And with that, I'll take any questions.
Any questions for Dr. Strauss?
Will this presentation be available online?
I believe so.
Yes. It will be posted to the SWFREC website.
But you can also, feel free to email me, and I can also present you with at least the PDF of the talk as well.
There's a question in the chat, Sarah, asking about pollinator-friendly cover crops.
Oh, okay. I don't see that, but sure. That's a good question. Unfortunately, yeah, I have not been able to, I talked to a number of entomologists about working on this project, and we just haven't quite gotten our systems connected yet, but that is something of interest. And so I know some of these definitely are better for attracting pollinators than others, but I do not have that information off the top of my head.
Please complete the post test. And if you are interested about CEUs, go to the chat box and there is information about it on how to earn CEUs. If you have been using cover crops and you want to share your experience, go ahead and tell us what you have been doing.
Angie, somebody just posted in the chat that sun hemp is a great bee plant.
Thank you, Julie. Any comments, any questions? Again, please complete the post-test. And as Dr. Strauss asking you about completing the survey. Thank you, Jean. Thank you, Julie. Thank you, Sarah. Very informative presentation.
One moment, Manji. Somebody has just raised their hand. If you can, go ahead and unmute and you can ask a question. There you go. Go ahead, Patricia.
Yes, hi. Do you mow these or do you just let them grow until the season's over and they die themselves?
That's a great question. Yeah, so it kind of depends on the season. For the winter cover crops that we let grow through harvest, by the time harvest is done and you know the goats and stuff have gone through, things are kind of get mowed down that way. We will mow again before we plant. And so yes, in general, we are mowing before we plant the next round. But we've also been letting these grow for quite a number of months. And so some of them naturally are dying off by the time we get around to planting the next one too. One of the things we're trying to do, which you don't see in row crops and vegetable crops, is that we actually want a lot of these to go to seed to provide and build up that seed bank. And so we've been trying to let them grow for as long as possible to get to that point. And that hopefully we have to plant fewer seeds in the future. But good question.
Thank you.
Along those same lines, Dr. Strauss, a comment. It's not clear to me if cover crops are intended to be terminated or if they can be left to grow and regenerate.
Well, no, that's a great question. And so it depends on the type of cover crop. And so some of these will, if you let them grow and produce seeds, you'll build up that seed bank and that will, you know, contribute to next round of cover crop growth. Others you might need to continue to plant, again, depending on, on the type of cover crop that you're planting. And so, you know, or things like perennial peanut, it's a perennial, it's going to stay there year round. Annuals, it really depends on that seed bank and that seed production. So I see a question about the inoculating the soil with rhizomes. Yes. We actually have a project going on right now looking at this, but in general, yes, when you're planting legumes, it's probably a good idea to inoculate them. You can buy inoculum commercially when you buy your legume seeds. They're often sold together. And so I would recommend that to really ensure that you're getting good nodulation for those legumes. There are rhizobia naturally occurring in our soils here. And so that's one of the projects that we're looking at, is trying to identify some of those native rhizobia and see how those differ versus the stuff that we're using for inoculation. But certainly to get started, I would recommend inoculating.
Are most of the cover crops legumes?
Pardon?
Are most of the cover crops legumes?
No, I mean, I think cover crops can be legumes and non-legumes. And so what mix you want to put in really depends on what some of your prior, main goals are with having cover crops.
Any other questions? Thank you all for your participation. And we will see you next month with another presentation. Don't forget to fill out the post-test and email your information if you need CEUs.